Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Yao Di. I'm the legal counsel in Google Shanghai. It's our great pleasure to invite Mr. David Gosset today to share with us his thoughts on China. David is an expert in international relations and is a sinologist, educator, and a patient bridge builder. He has established the Europe-China Forum in 2002 and the New Silk Road Initiative in 2015. David is devoted to build a higher understanding between China and the West. And he received from the former King of Spain, Juan Carlos, the Cross of the Civil Order, also received the French Legion of Honor, France's highest distinction. David is the author of limited reviews on the Chinese Renaissance, published in 2018. And we will hear from him today to talk about some of the insights in the book. Then I will host a fireside chat with David to talk about some of the hot topics. Let's give David a nice Google welcome. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for the wonderful introduction, your very kind words, and the nice, warm Google welcome. And also, of course, I am very happy to have this conversation with you today. I am extremely grateful because you put the book Limited Views on the Chinese Renaissance, but remember that they are real limited views. And what I love also here, because one should not take oneself too seriously, is the wonderful caricature of myself. So thank you very much for the friendship, the humor, and I'm very happy to have this sharing. To share is very important. To share only for sharing. There is no other goal today. And also I am very happy, Mr. Ya, to have a conversation directly with you. After this very short presentation, you told me to speak for 20, 30 minutes. I will try to be as concise as possible. But of course, I would like to share with you my views on China, the Chinese dynamics, but we cannot disconnect China from the world. Therefore, before I go into the core of the presentation, if you wish, meaning to try to understand better the Chinese Renaissance and the dynamics defining this Chinese Renaissance, I would like to tell you a couple of things about the big global picture. And I think if there is a concept that I would like to share with you today is the concept of complexity. We live in a world which has never been so complex. Because in my narrative, the combination of 4 factors. So by the way, on each of the factors we could spend several hours, but I will try to present these factors in a very concise way. Number 1, please, demography matters. And we live in a world in which we have very deep demographic changes. And I think about 3 very simple things. Number 1, well, we live today in a world of 7.5 billion people. Put this into perspective. The population of the world in 1850 was less than the population of China today. Therefore, we have an increase in terms of world population, and we will live in a world around 2050 in which we will be close to 10 billion. And I tell you that because I think the way we consume, the way we produce is simply not sustainable. Therefore, the issue of sustainability is also an important notion. When you think about demographic change, please also remember that our societies across the globe are becoming increasingly complex because the life expectancy is also increasing. So above 80 in many countries, but we will live in a world very soon, in 2-3 decades from now, in which the life expectancy will be around 90. This will have significant impact on our societies. And last but not least, when we think about demographic change, is of course the phenomenon of urbanization. Most of us now we live in cities, and I am very happy to tell this at Google. It is the time for all of us, be it in China or outside of China, to stop building dumb cities. We have the technology to build smarter cities. We should work seriously on the building of smart cities. By the way, China, we will come back to that later, is doing a good job in that field. So this is a very important element of change, demographic change. Of course, at Google, at tools at Google, we cannot not to think about technological change. These are very important elements of a world, I repeat, which has never been so complex. And when I think about technological change, of course I am thinking about you. Google as the symbol of the digital dimension. But here I would like also to conceptualize. You said, Mr. Yao, that I am a specialist of international relations. For us, now when we look at power, also things are becoming more and more complex because traditionally we were looking at territories, land, first strategic dimension, of course the maritime dimension, that has been always very important, air, this is also a very important strategic dimension, space, we live in a world in which space is extremely important. You remember the Sputnik moment in 1957, but we have added another strategic dimension, which is cyberspace, and therefore I call the cyberspace the fifth strategic dimension. It is an element of complexity. So you have the cyber element. Of course, in continuity with the cyber element, you have the disruption of artificial intelligence. There is no hype about AI. We live already in a world of algorithms. It is a reality. The impact of this is absolutely enormous. Absolutely enormous, and we will have to discuss the impact of this AI moment or this AI disruption. Cyberspace, AI. Here I would add, because I think it is important for the debate, and especially important since we are in China, the two applications of quantum physics, meaning one, quantum computing, and second, quantum communication. And here, you know, but it is interesting to think about that, in quantum communication, China is not catching up. China is at the avant-garde, and this will have some very interesting and important implications. The last element I want to put on the table, thinking about technological change, it is what is going on, and it is also a major disruption which is less discussed than AI, and I think it is a mistake. The change in the field of biology with gene editing. This is extremely important. It raises many questions. And you know also that China is going very fast in this field of CRISPR or gene editing. So, demographic change, technological change. The third element in my narrative, if you wish, contributing to a world which has never been so complex, is what I would call power diffusion. What do I mean by power diffusion? It is very simple. I can see all of you, of course, in your hands, you have a mobile phone device. And of course, you are connected to the cyberspace. Well, this device allows all of us across the world to do two things in an unprecedented way. Number one, to access information. And information is power, of course. To access information, to have access to knowledge, thanks also to your company, by the way, empowers individuals in a way which has no equivalent in the past of the history of mankind. This is as simple as that. And it allows all of us, thanks to the social media, the social networks, to be a broadcaster. All of us, we are potentially a media. And this is a very important change. In my thinking, I am not telling that the social networks are the cause of populisms. But I think that the social media, the social networks, are the ideal media for the populists. So this element of power diffusion is very important, very deep, and in my narrative creates also an unprecedented level of complexity. The fourth element of change, and we come gradually to China, and I apologize for this too long introduction, is geopolitical change. We have simultaneously to think, to understand, to deal with demographic change, technological change, this phenomenon of power diffusion, remember access to information and capacity to broadcast, and we are going through a major moment in terms of geopolitical change. To put it in one or two sentences, the world clearly is not bipolar anymore. You remember the structure of global affairs from 1945 to 1991, at the moment when the USSR collapsed. The world is not bipolar. The world is not unipolar, because you remember all this literature around the idea of the end of history, Francis Fukuyama, the idea that the United States of America would be at the center of a world in which we would have more and more globalization. Well, clearly it was a theoretical fantasy. The world is clearly multipolar. This is not the world of the G7. We had the G7 in France very recently in the city of Biarritz. This is the world of the G20. And in the G20, all the continents are represented. We have Latin America, we have Africa, with South Africa, we have the Middle East, Turkey and Saudi Arabia, and of course we have Asia. But today, I'm very happy also to introduce another concept. I think multipolarity is not enough to describe current geopolitical dynamics. In fact, what characterizes our world is also multi-conceptuality, meaning that we have different sources of power, economic, political, but we have also different different understanding of what it means to be modern. We have the Western understanding, but also I would argue that we have the Muslim understanding, we have the Indian understanding, and last but not least, we have the Chinese understanding of what it means to be modern, and the book is also an introduction to this narrative. And when I think about geopolitical change, I would argue, and especially from the notion of a multi-conceptual world, I would argue that China is the major factor of change in the world in which we live. Therefore, we need many more talks at Google to discuss this aspect of global change. Many more talks, many more, because one certainly is absolutely not enough. So I would tell you that if I am asked, what do you mean by China is the major factor of change in today's world? Well, my answer would be, please try to understand without passion. The debate around China is too passionate. We need to have a more rational, reasonable, nuanced approach of China. And by the way, Sinophobia is a mistake, but Sinomania is also a mistake. We need also to understand that China is far to be perfect, but we need also to understand what the Chinese Renaissance means. And today, I would like to introduce to 4 very simple ideas. 4. Number 1, I think the Chinese Renaissance, when you look at China as a market, and many people look at China as a market only, or as an economy, a very important element contributing to the Chinese Renaissance would be what I call China's rapid, the notion of speed here is very important, economic re-emergence. Please, this is a message I would like to convey. It's not really accurate to look at China as a rising power or emerging economy. China is only coming back to a position of centrality this country had for many centuries. You remember that China has been marginalized for the past 150 years because China did not catch the train of the Industrial Revolution. But the Industrial Revolution is yesterday. It's yesterday. The end of the 18th century is yesterday. China has been marginalized, but China is coming back, re-emerging. Therefore, sometimes when you discuss China outside of China, people are very surprised by the global change and the new role of China. But very often, when I am in China, I feel that in the eyes of the Chinese people I meet, there is the sense that, sorry, it is the end of an anomaly and the coming back of something that many Chinese consider to be normal. On this re-emergence, just allow me to share 3 figures because they are very useful. When you look at the Chinese economy today, you know that very well, 14 trillion US dollars, meaning that China is already 15% of the world economy. In 1978, when Deng Xiaoping opened China to the world, 1978 is really yesterday, the Chinese economy was less than 2% of the world economy. It was 1.7%. So you see, if you compare 1978 and now, China is rising. But remember that at the end of the 18th century, and it was true for the 2 first decades of the 19th century, the Chinese economy was 20% of the world economy. So, of course, the Chinese economy will be, again, relatively soon, 20% of the world economy, and it will be a comeback, not a rise. And we have many discussions, and it's always good to have discussions on China's growth. In my book and my narrative, my current reflections on China, I stick to the idea that China's comeback, China's reemergence is rapid. Because, of course, as Premier Li Keqiang just said, for China to grow at 6% or 6.2, probably it will be 6.2, 6.3 this year is not easy. But, of course, it's less and less easy because think that now China has an economy of 14 trillion US. But China is still growing relatively fast. And remember that when you look at the GDP per capita in China, still relatively low. Therefore, think about the potential which is ahead of us for China. Therefore, when we discuss the Chinese Renaissance, this is one aspect. But please, China is much more than an economy. The second element defining the Chinese Renaissance in my narrative, and I try to discuss that also in the book, is what I call China's socio-political transformation. So this is a fascinating topic which needs to be discussed from many, many, many different angles. But if you wish, I insist on this idea that when you compare China with herself, today's China with yesterday's China. And when I say yesterday's China, I am thinking about the past 5 millennia. Sorry, because this is what China is all about, history. We need to keep this historical perspective in mind. Well, when you compare today's China with yesterday's China, I think many of you, because you know China very well by definition, you would agree with the fact that we could argue that never ever before the Chinese individuals enjoyed such a degree of individual freedom. Freedom to travel within China, freedom to travel abroad, freedom to study abroad, freedom to create a company. You know, China is an incredibly entrepreneurial country. Last year, per day, we saw in China the creation of more than 16,000 private companies. It is a very important freedom. But what I would like to put on the table, it is this idea that the outcome of this socio-political transformation would not necessarily be what the West considers to be political modernity. In my narrative, and it is very important, I weight my words, China is on the path to create her own political modernity. And if you want to understand what this Chinese political modernity means, I think it is very important to have in mind to discuss and to think about the dichotomy good governance, bad governance. The notion of governance is at the center of the Chinese understanding of politics and political modernity. The third element, time is running, I am aware of that, which is to a certain extent more important than economy and the social-political transformation, or to a certain extent which explains the first and the second dynamic, is about China as a civilization. Please, China is not only an economy. China is not only a political entity, China is fundamentally a civilization. And I would say a living, ancient civilization. And from that perspective, this is something very unique. And if you ask me, look, David, you speak about the Chinese Renaissance, you look at China as a civilization, what do you mean? I would look at this, I would suggest us to think about a process of intellectual and cultural metamorphosis. Not a re-emergence, not a transformation, but a change which is a metamorphosis, meaning that things are changing in the surface, but China essentially remains Chinese. And here I would distinguish the visible and the invisible. And at the visible level, what people wear, what people eat, what people drink, I would say that China, today's China, is about the attempt to reinvent or renew what it means to be Chinese. And at the invisible level, what people think, the way Chinese people look at the world, and especially the intellectuals here, I would say, it is an effort by the Chinese intellectuals to reinterpret Chinese classical tradition in order for China to enter her own modernity. This intellectual and cultural metamorphosis is about this process of reinvention of Chineseness and reinterpretation of the Chinese classical tradition. Therefore, I would suggest the friends listening to us here is if they want to understand China, also contemporary China, to go back to Confucius and the classics. And here you have many analogies that we do not have time to develop between the Chinese Renaissance of the 21st century and the Italian Renaissance, actually, of the 14th, 15th, 16th century, which leads me to my fourth point in the attempt, which is our attempt to define the Chinese Renaissance. What is the Chinese Renaissance? Rapid economic reemergence, socio-political transformation whose outcome is going to be Chinese political modernity. In other words, it seems to me that China is going to enrich the vocabulary of the Western political science. The Chinese Renaissance is this process of intellectual and cultural metamorphosis. By the way, and here I repeat, when I talk about metamorphosis, it means, and it is the same, that from China as a civilization's perspective, modernization does not equal westernization. This is a very important element of my narrative and many others, of course, scholars. The fourth aspect is very new. It's very new, and I think we have never seen such a thing in the history of mankind, especially when you look at the history of the relations between China and the world. I want to talk about global China. This is also a very important element of the Chinese Renaissance. Since 1978, China is open to the world. But when Deng Xiaoping said Kaifang, opening up, he was also thinking the world comes to China, but China goes to the world. And here I would like us to think about at least 8 vectors of Chinese global projection. Goods, you know, the massive amount of Chinese export. 2 years ago, it was the equivalent of the Indian economy. So this is massive. But let us remember that China is already exporting technology. So this is significant. many fields. China is projecting herself globally through people. Look, 1/3 of the international students in the US are Chinese. This is important. We live in a world in which Chinese tourists are reshaping global tourism industry. Very soon, this is the Chinese national holidays. You will see Chinese people traveling all around the world. This is a very interesting phenomenon. This is new. So we need to discuss, we need to understand, and we need to anticipate. So China is projecting herself globally through goods, technology, people, of course, capital. Think about the massive amount of Chinese investments outside of China. Therefore, we have been discussing FDI for many years now, and we need to think about ODI, Chinese outbound direct investments. This is very important. Goods, technology, people, finance, I would say, culture. Because China, as a living matrix of civilization, cannot be a passive spectator in a Western-led globalization. China is exporting its culture, Chinese traditional medicine, of course, Chinese language. You know that actually in many countries, the demand to learn Chinese is so high that there is a problem to find Chinese teachers. Well, this is the world in which we live. And with the Chinese Renaissance, meaning with the growing attractiveness of China to a certain extent, the demand for Chinese language will become higher and higher. This is a very interesting phenomenon. China is projecting herself globally through diplomacy. And we have no time, really, we have no time, but you know, the Itailu, the Belt and Road, or this idea of reinventing the ancient Silk Roads, this idea of co-building new Silk Roads is very significant. This is also a part of a global China. China is projecting itself globally through military. This is also an interesting element to look at, which you understand, because when 13% of your oil comes from Angola, Angola is not next door, you need to secure your supply line. Therefore, this is a process which is going on. We need to understand, and we need to have a conversation when it creates uneasiness in different parts of the world. I think here explanation and dialogue are absolutely key. And the last point I would like to share for us to discuss, I think that you will see also increasingly China as a force of proposition, meaning I would talk here about a kind of Chinese intellectual global projection. You know, I take very seriously the notion of 人类命运共同体, a shared community of shared destiny for mankind. You know, this is typically a concept like 人类命运共同体, which is not so easy to translate into English. But this is very, very important because, of course, Chinese intellectuals would understand immediately that this is a reinterpretation of the classical idea of Datong, the great unity. Therefore, we go back to Confucius. But this is Datong in the 21st century, and it seems to me that this is a very constructive global proposal in a world threatened by divisions. So we need to have this perspective to reform together the global governance, but with a vision. And the vision is the right of a more cohesive mankind, if I may say. So this is an aspect that we will have to discuss more and more. Look, that's what I wanted to tell you. As a conclusion, Mr. Yap, before we discuss, I often hear, I am between two trips, Europe, China, China, Europe, before I come back to Asia. So I can hear, and I try to pay attention to also the conversation, the debates in the media. I often hear, but what China wants? This question, what are the strategic intentions of China? Look, then clearly we would need many other talks. But first, I would like to tell you that my limited views on China and the Chinese Renaissance create a situation in which, if I am asked this question, the first thing I say is that, please, because there is a book which has had some success, whose title is When China Rules the World. I don't think this is a very accurate and constructive title. Actually, what China wants, for those people who know a little bit China, the complexity of the Chinese world, what China wants is, first of all, to rule China. Because when you are in charge of China, your main concern is China. Therefore, those playing with fueling this xenophobia, with this idea that China wants to rule the world, I think they are disconnected from the reality. China wants to rule itself in an appropriate way, in a harmonious way. It has always been the strategic intentions of China. Now, it is also true to say that China is projecting itself globally. It is also true. So, therefore, while I would tell you China wants to rule China properly, wisely, this is true. At the same time, China, because of the Chinese Renaissance, has more and more power. And I would here introduce a notion that we could discuss. It seems to me that China is not obsessed with leadership, but because China is Chinese, China needs, I would even say, centrality. And I would end with this notion of centrality. You know, when you say China in Chinese, of course, you say 中国, meaning the central or middle country. The notion of 中 in Chinese is very rich. I think there is an article in the book on the polysemy of 中, and this is centrality. In the Chinese culture, centrality is extremely important. You know, in the Chinese tradition, it was not 4 cardinal points, but 5. North, south, east, west, and the center. And the center is what matters. And centrality and leadership are 2 different things. Therefore, I would end this conversation, the first part of the conversation, by saying China wants to rule itself wisely, and China is in a process of regaining centrality. Thank you, Mr. Ya.
Thanks so much, Ms. Gosset. Very insightful. You talk a lot about Chinese classic concepts in your book. So I want to start it with talk about some of those concepts. My first question is actually about Tao Te Ching and East and the West. I found a super interesting theory in your book. You said the East and the West, like yin and yang, should not be interpreted as 2 definitive standing blocks, absolutely external to each other, but as 2 active poles that complement and nourish each other. I totally agree. My follow-up question would be, what's your view on the status quo right now? And there are certainly some blocking issues right now. And how do we complement and nourish each other at this critical moment?
Well, you told me, Mr. Yar, to be very concise, but how can I be concise when you ask such deep and large question? But thank you for asking, because by the way, I think when you want to understand China, history and culture are absolutely key, because they are having a deep impact on today's China, and actually increasingly on today's world. And when you think about Chinese culture, Chinese philosophy, you mentioned the yin and the yang. These are very important, fundamental principles at the core of the Chinese civilization. This is absolutely key. And what I want to say before I go back to the East and West is to tell you that the yin and the yang philosophy introduces us to something which is not so easy for Westerners to understand, is that the yin and the yang are not the same, but they are also the same. This is an introduction to inclusive opposites, not exclusive opposites. And sometimes when you need to simplify, I say, look, the West is to be or not to be. Yeah. China is to be and not to be. And it's both are beautiful. It seems to me that to be and not to be is something extremely deep. In other words, it is an introduction to a civilization for which contradiction is seen in a positive way. And this is a deep question, because when you look at the West, for the West, everything begins in classical Greece. Yeah. Well, you read Aristotle, that's Aristotle. Such a great thinker, but he introduced this idea for the Western civilization that contradiction is not good. Well, in China, contradiction is something positive and the source of life. By the way, when you look at what quantum physics says, I'm not surprised to see that Chinese are so comfortable with quantum physics, because quantum physics is so Chinese. You can be simultaneously at two different points. This is intriguing, but that's what quantum physics is all about. And Mr. Yar, to go back to the East and West, they are different, but in fact, when you look at the realities, historical or present realities, they nourish each other. Look, sorry, I was mentioning classical Greece, which is so important, as classical China is important to understand today's China. But the Greeks, they always said, well, they define themselves by contrast with the East. Actually, it was the Persian world. And in the Chinese tradition, you remember this beautiful book that you have, The Journey to the West. Xi. That here it's not done for European. Of course, you define yourself by contrast with the East. But in the Chinese psyche, you look at yourself by contrast with the West. Therefore, you know, Mr. Yar, you were mentioning the status quo, and I go back to your question. You have a lot of noise. And I have to say that the noise is also produced by some politicians that we don't need to mention today. But in reality, this relation, inclusive opposite between the East and the West is a reality. think about you, Mr. Ya. You studied in the US, and therefore the West gave you so many things. It helps you to reinvent what it means to be Chinese. And for me, because I am a European, I was born in Paris, and China is helping me every day to better understand what the West, and specifically what Europe, is all about. Therefore, let us go beyond the noise. And let us pay attention, but really pay attention to the realities. And in reality, the East grows with the West, and the West grows with the East.
Okay. We're nourished by the both sides, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
The second question is about the Romance of Three Kingdom, 三国演义. Another Chinese classic you raise in your book is from 三国演义, the three kingdoms that the world and heaven, after a long period of division, tends to unite. After a long period, union tends to divide. In Chinese, 天下大势，分久必合，合久必分. What's the status quo? How do you see the future? Tends to unite or a long period of division?
Thank you. And for those who in China, almost impossible, but outside of China, who did not the kingdoms, I invite all of you to read it carefully, to pay attention. It's also one of the many good introductions to the Chinese civilization. And as you said, what strikes me in this 天下大势, the mega trends, and the first part of this, in fact, this is the incipit, this is the very beginning of this novel, is fun 就必合. Fun 就必合, meaning after separation, a long division, you have more unity. And after unity comes the separation. This is this idea of a cyclical approach of time and of history, not linear. But indeed, first you have the division. And after the division comes the unity. And despite what we have been saying about globalization, which I think is a very soft concept, actually. Yes, there is growing interdependence, but it seems to me that we live in a very divided world. Divisions between the East and the West, largely artificial to a certain extent, because also what we said about the East and the West previously. Economic divisions, inequalities, on a very serious global issue that one needs to tackle. And therefore, I would say our world is dangerously divided. And again, there are some political forces which fuel the divisions. And I think that what we need to do is to create a situation in which from divisions we have more cohesiveness and unity. It is why in the short presentation I said we need to reinvent global governance. Actually, my narrative, we might disagree, but is that it's not because the UN, the United Nations, do not work properly that we need to throw it into the dustbin. We need to reform it. It is not because the WTO, World Trade Organization, is not working as it should that we need to throw it away. We need to reinvent a WTO for the 21st century and a WTO in which technology plays such a role. Therefore, I see that because of technological forces, also, this is an important element in my narrative, and because of also the wisdom of many, not politicians, but I would say statesmen, we are going to go after downs, after tensions, through crisis, toward a more unified, cohesive mankind. What I came to you, Mr. Ya, today with the idea that I am not pro-China or pro-France or pro-US. I look at myself as someone pro-mankind.
That's really powerful. That's really powerful. Next question is about technology. You mentioned about technology. It's a big part of your philosophy. You wrote an article about Weiqi and chess in 2015. In the article, a general conclusion, if I may say, you do, is that the inspiration by the intelligence of Weiqi, the goal, has outwitted the calculation of a chess player. And you ended your article with a famous Chinese poet, Ouyang Xiu, in his poem, Written in a Dream. The Weiqi game comes to an end. One is unaware that in the meantime, the world has changed. 1 year later, after you wrote the article in 2016, AlphaGo defeated Nintendo in Go game 4-1. What's your takeaway from that game? I heard that you were right in the place in Wuzhen. In Wuzhen. Yeah. What's your views on AlphaGo or AI technology in general? Does technology change how you see the world? Yeah.
Well, thank you, and again, thank you for mentioning Ouyang Xiu, who is a wonderful poet, and this is a beautiful poem. So many things here to say. Yes, Mr. Ya, I was in the room in 2017. I remember vividly. It was May 23rd because May 23rd is my birthday. And when Ke, Chinese Go player, was defeated by AlphaGo. And by the way, Ke played wonderfully. I mean, I think Ke was at its best. So I have seen, 10 meters away, the struggle between the human brain and artificial intelligence, and AI won. That's what I have seen. So, by the way, I repeat, AI is not a hype. We live in a world in which AI plays a very important role. It's a very powerful tool. By the way, I am one of those who argue, I mentioned the UN, for the UN to organize an agency to discuss and to look at the implications of AI, as we did that for the atomic age. AI should not be discussed only by a bunch of private companies. This is about the future of all of us, mankind. And therefore, the US needs to play a role. Having said that, Mr. Ya, I am aware, you are also aware, that the debates, artificial intelligence versus human intelligence. I tell you a story. So I remember, for me, May 23rd, 2017 is that like exactly yesterday. I love to play Go, so I was really into the game. Yes, Ke was defeated. Yes, AlphaGo is very powerful. DeepMind is a wonderful company, and you know that DeepMind is a part of Google. But then, after the defeat of Ke, I went out and I had this magic encounter with Demis Hassabis. So the founder of AlphaGo. And Demis Hassabis, a wonderful man, extremely modest and so on, but I could see from his smile that he was also very happy. And Demis Hassabis, the intelligence of Demis Hassabis is not artificial intelligence, it is human intelligence. Therefore, let us not forget that beyond artificial intelligence, you have human intelligence. Therefore, I am cautiously prudent and cautiously optimistic. And you know, of course, at the end of the day, what is important is the power of AI to understand and how we are going to use it for the good, for public good, then to understand the power of human intelligence. But there is even more important than human intelligence. This is human wisdom. Wisdom. And at the end of the day, for example, that would be very interesting to have another talk at Google about how artificial intelligence would be able to manage and to deal with contradictions. And, well, that's for another talk. And how, but I'm saying dealing with very deep, profound contradictions at the center, at the core, at the heart of what defines a human being, between finite and the infinite, between death and the absolute of religion, God, and so on. Therefore, I bet on the depth, the power, and the wisdom, and on the human wisdom.
Thanks for that. That's the end of all on my part. Is there any questions here?
What do you think is the different point of view between European countries and the U.S. Towards the rise of China, if there's any, and why is there such different point of view?
Well, this is a very important question, sir. I think there is a serious difference in terms of perception. You know, first of all, from an American perspective, what one needs also to understand is that the US is still in a position of dominance. Therefore, they look at China or the Chinese Renaissance. Some people in the US look at the Chinese Renaissance as a threat. Therefore, we need to have a conversation with these people saying, but why a threat? Because all the issues, serious issues we have nowadays, they are global issues. Therefore, this is together China, the West, China with the US, that we have a chance to tackle these global issues. And the Chinese Renaissance, in fact, can also be interpreted, this is my interpretation, as an historical opportunity. So therefore, there is this, there is in the air at the moment in the US, the Sinophobia, the fear of China, that I do not detect as such in Europe. And, you know, but therefore, a very also important part of the conversation should be what are the causes of xenophobia and how do we deconstruct the prejudice, how do we deconstruct the misconceptions in order to decrease the level of xenophobia. Again, to have a global view and to value cooperation. And going back to Europe, you know, what is very striking when you work on China, Europe, is of course the differences, but also the many commonalities. You know, Europe is very diverse. The European pluralism is very, very obvious. And sometimes I look at China as the Europe of the Far East, because that's another misconception. People, they think that China is a very homogeneous country, which is simply not true. Again, this analogy, Europe as the China of the West and China as Europe of the East is an interesting analogy. The difference would be the attitude toward unity, because the quest for unity has also always been one of the constant, the permanent features of the Chinese civilization, while Europe is less obsessed by unity. So this is a commonality. Another commonality, sir, do not forget that both Europe and China are very sensitive to historical depth. You see, today, in a very natural way, we spoke about classical Greece and classical China. At the end of the day, the history of the US technically begins in 1776. So the US is a very young political construction, absolutely key, but very young political construction. And last but not least, remember, and this is very important, and we come back to the East and the West, China and Europe, they are located on the same mega continent, Eurasia. And I was telling you that Itailu, the Belt and Road, is an attempt to reinvent the ancient Silk Roads. We had the ancient Silk Roads because Europe and China are on the same mega continent, Eurasia. And I invite all of us to think seriously about the notion of Eurasia and how Europe and China are trying to build synergies on this mega continent. So there is a difference of perception. Some people in the US, again, the US is also a very diverse and fascinating country. Therefore, some people in Washington, D.C. would like to see Europe aligned with the US on certain issues vis-à-vis China. I think it is everybody would understand that as a European, I am telling you, Europe is Europe, France is France, and a country like France cares a lot about its independence, and strategic independence is also very important. And Europe has an absolutely vital role to play in order to make sure that the US and China cooperate in the 21st century for peace and shared prosperity. This is absolutely key.
Thanks. I'll take one last question.
So my question is, you know that there is like the Industrial Revolution in Europe, and I wonder why China never happened. And I see that before the 1800, the speed of growth in China was pretty extensive, and after the 1800 was more intensive. However, it's still, we were missing out of this whole dramatic change. So I would like to have your opinion on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam. Well, clearly a question for another talk at Google, because this is massive, but this is absolutely fundamental question. First of all, Madam, your question allows me to tell you another thing. Very often outside of China, people are trying to understand, but why China has such an appetite for innovation today? Well, what they need to understand is the trauma of the fact that China did not catch the Industrial Revolution at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, on the Chinese elites. Therefore, when you look at the world affairs today, of course, China does not want to repeat what happened at the end of the 18th or the 19th century. This is a very important point. Then, madam, you have another, at the core of your question, this is why China did not catch this train. Look, Qianlong has been a very important emperor, but he ruled for a very, very, very long time, and he had a very high idea of himself, and actually of his empire. Here I invite you to read the letter he wrote, Qianlong, the Qianlong emperor wrote, we in 1793 to George III, the king of Great Britain. And basically Qianlong was saying, look, I am happy to see that you sent an envoy, but my empire is well governed. I don't need you. And like that. So arrogance is never good. Of course, it has to be always a middle way. Therefore, too modest does not work. Arrogance does not work. But you need to maintain a certain level of openness. This is very, very important. But, madam, I want also use this moment to recommend a wonderful book. One of the most important sinologists of the 20th century actually is a British whose name is Joseph Needham. He wrote 14 volumes. This is nothing. These are limited views I read. But Joseph Needham wrote 14 volumes on the topic of science and technology in China. And actually, what motivated him, that's what we call the Needham question, was to try to understand why China did not catch the train of the Industrial Revolution. And at the end of his life, Needham said, I am asking myself the wrong question. The right question would be, because you cannot work on the causes of something which did not happen. What makes more sense is to look at the causes of something which did happen. Therefore, he said, the context in Europe was unique, and the miracle from that perspective is the European Industrial Revolution. So this is a reversal of your question, if you wish, but this is a very, very, very important question. And I want to repeat, you explained today's China's appetite for innovation by contrast with the Chinese trauma, the fact that China has been marginalized. And it allows me also to rebound on Joseph Needham. Please, those who think that China is condemned to imitate, they simply, it seems to me, ignore the Chinese history, because I repeat, Joseph Needham wrote 14 volumes on science and technology in China. Of course, he's talking about the glorious Chinese technology and science before the Ming Dynasty, but it did happen. And a corollary of my thinking on the Chinese Renaissance is that we are going to live in a world in which Chinese technology will have enormous contribution to the life of 1.4 billion people, but also to mankind.
Thanks so much. Let's give another round of applause.
Thank you very much. Thank you.